Hey, Deliberate Leaders. I am your host, Allison Dunn, executive coach and founder of the Deliberate Leaders podcast, dedicated to helping leaders build strong, thriving businesses. Each episode, we feature inspiring interviews to help you on your leadership journey. And today's guest is not only an author of Own Your Culture, he is also a culture expert and CEO, Bretton Putter. Brett is a leading expert on startup and high growth company cultures. He is the founder and CEO of CultureGene, which is a culture development platform helping companies to transition effectively to remote work. No small challenge here. After interviewing more than 5,000 senior executives over the past 16 years, Brett has become a specialist in understanding how individuals define, develop, and implement their company cultures. Brett, thanks so much for joining us here today on Deliberate Leaders.
Ellie, my pleasure. Really great to join, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I love to kick these off with a quick, deliberate conversation. And so the question of the day is, what would be your number one leadership tip for our listeners?
Number one leadership tip for your listeners is to have what I call the "we're on the moon" conversation.
Tell me.
The on the moon conversation is basically saying to your team, the world has changed. The world has changed so that it's almost unrecognizable. Obviously, we do recognize it, but I would rather you looked at it as if we were on Earth. We were warned ahead of time that Earth was going to be obliterated by an asteroid, so we all flew to the moon. Now, on the moon, the gravity is different. What we wear is different. What we eat is different. Everything's changed. And we're not going back to the way the Earth was. Yes, we may go and visit it from the moon from time to time, and we may experience some of it, but we're not going back. And I think the sooner leaders have this conversation with their people, the sooner they can move forward into building a new, relevant, hybrid or remote work culture for their business.
That's a great tip. I have to admit that one has not been shared before. You may be up there as the most unique tip yet. So thank you very much. I think one of the things that really interests me, and I'm going to enjoy your perspective on it, but that you've basically pointed out that the lack of culture development may be its own pandemic. So could you share your brilliance and insights into that?
Sure. So essentially, a pandemic is a global phenomenon, and it's a threat. And so the lack of culture development is in existence in the vast majority of companies around the world. When I wrote Own Your Culture, I interviewed just over 50 leaders. But to interview 50, I had to speak to over 500. So 1 out of 10 companies has done something about their culture, and only half of those have done a good job about their culture, essentially. So what we have is we have people working in environments where they shouldn't be. They're working in the wrong culture, the wrong environment. They have mismatched values, which then puts stress on them. And people have to wear a mask when their values don't match the leader's values or the rest of the team's values. And wearing a mask is hard, it's stressful, and you can't be yourself. And that is one of the reasons why engagement globally, according to Gallup, is so low. That is one of the reasons why I believe we've been in this slow building, bubbling pandemic of lack of culture development for years. And this moment in time is going to force leaders to realize how critical culture is, because we don't have the officers to fall back on. We can't be lazy about our culture and expect our officers to give us learning through osmosis and learning through informal communication, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really my point on this pandemic, the second pandemic that isn't as immediately threatening, but is a really serious issue.
I will share that I really very consistently hear, how am I supposed to have a company culture if people don't come to the office? And how do we maintain that? what would be some of your suggestions for people to be thinking about and broaden their mind about it not just being around a physical space?
Yeah, so your company culture is a random combination of values, mission, vision, behaviors, communication styles, rituals, habits, routines, good and bad. And actually your culture develops over time. So as you learn what works, you develop these good and bad behaviors. And actually, if you as a leader step back and say, what's the underlying foundations of my culture? It's the values, because they're your values and hopefully the rest of your team's values. And it's the mission, what you do every day, and the vision, where you're planning on going. And so I think if you haven't done any work yet on values, mission, and vision, that's where you start. And then what you need to do is you need to start to build a culture around what I call remote first work. What that means is you have to be more deliberate about communication. You have to be more deliberate about social connection. You have to be more deliberate about documentation, about processizing your business. And ideally, you would look at companies like GitLab or Buffer or Hotjar, these companies that have been remote for 5 or 10 years, and learn about what they do so well, because this is your future. Your future, even if it's hybrid, involves people who we were working remotely for some time. So if you study what remote companies do well, you can then start to adapt your business over time, which helps your culture adapt. Remember, most people see culture as this amorphous, invisible, subconscious, intangible thing, but actually it's a very visible, conscious, tangible thing to great leaders who make it so, whether you're remote or whether you're hybrid or whether you're in an office.
That's a great definition of culture and how many facets of that actually like incorporate it, and that it's building every time you add someone new, every time you allow something to happen. You have a way to create a magnetic company culture through a decision checklist. Can you just explain what that is and why people should review their checklist?
Sure. So this is particularly focused at leaders. The decision checklist is based around how culture is embedded in an organization. So there are only 6 ways to embed culture, and essentially this is the checklist. The checklist is, what are we reward and recognizing? What are we measuring and paying attention to? What are we doing when it comes to allocating resources, and how are we allocating resources in our organization? What are we doing when it comes to training, when it comes to learning, L&D? How are we doing when it comes to crisis behavior or difficult decision behavior? And then how are we hiring, firing, and promoting? That's it. Those 6 things are your decision checklist. In other words, if you say customer success is important, but you're not rewarding and recognizing it, you're not paying attention to it or measuring it, and you're not hiring good people for it, your people know you're lying. So your culture is being broken, you are creating a false expectation for your people. So if you look at these 6 embedding mechanisms and go, do I and my team live the values against these embedding mechanisms? And do we look at our culture through this lens of these 6 embedding mechanisms, these 6 checklists points? Then I think it's a lot easier to run a business and embed a strong functional culture.
So you've interviewed a lot of executives, and to come up with just a handful of good ones. Why do you believe that companies and/or its leadership struggles with the accuracy of defining their culture and then living it as well?
Yeah, so actually culture is hard to define because it's changing all the time, and it is all over the place. So if when leaders say to me, I hire for culture fit, after I've said nonsense, I actually ask them to accurately define their culture, and they can't, because it is hard. But if you understand what your foundations, your values, your mission, and your vision are, and then you start building it out from there, you can start to make more of it come to the surface, more of it visible, conscious, and tangible. So that's really, the great leaders are doing this every day, all day. They're thinking about, how do I apply my culture here? How do I think about how this matches against my culture? And so the best way really to approach this is to go and say, I use this example. The easiest way to help people think about culture is, who is person X? Person X is somebody who you've worked with, who you just didn't get on with. They didn't work the way everybody else did. They just didn't fit in for some reason, or they behaved badly, or they behaved incorrectly. And so what I say is, first of all, remember who person X is from your past, or from your current role, from your current role, and then define person X, and then hire people who are not person X, and start building your culture in that way. The things that you expect from your team.
And in helping a business develop and implement a value-based hiring process, is there any other tools that they can use other than taking an example of someone who you don't want to hire? What other tips might you give so that we really are honing in on like the right value-based that connects with the person, so we're not wearing our masks?
Yeah. So this is a really important point for leaders, because there are only two ways to break your culture if you have a strong functional one. The first one is if you start doing things that do not work with the embedding mechanisms, with those 6 embedding mechanisms. Basically, you lie to your people, or you allow people in who are the wrong fit with your values. So what most companies do is they say, these are our values, we've done this exercise, and they used to stick them up on the walls, and nothing changed. But what we do as a company with our clients is we say, okay, let's define your values, and now let's define the expected behaviors against those values. So, for example, if a value of the company was teamwork is actually, it's vague. What does teamwork mean? We kind of have an idea, but we could all have different interpretations. So on the one hand, it could be a group of people coming together with a common goal. On the other hand, it could be the team always comes first, depending on who's interpreting this word. So what we do, let's say in my company, is I say, the value is teamwork, the expected behavior is the team always comes first. And then what we do is we build an interview question against the behavior, against the value. So the interview question here would be, when last did you take one for the team, and why? And this is a really powerful question, because you can't lie. It's very hard to lie around this. It's because then you ask deeper and deeper and deeper questions about the impact, why they did that, what their preparation was, what the results were, what they learned from it. And if you ask every single candidate exactly the same question, values-based question, you can evaluate them and score them against it. So you need to take your values, define behaviors, and then build interview questions against those behaviors.
Yeah. There's a lot of discussion around the fact, there's a lot of words that you can't actually figure out how to behave to achieve them. And so that's a common exercise that I work through with clients of, so exactly what does integrity look like, right? And so what are better words that we could use so that people can understand, like, oh, that's, being, trustworthy, or something else that they can resonate with. So I like the fact that you're driving and aligning with the concept of it's a behavior-driven value system.
Absolutely. You can't easily see a value in action, but you can see the behavior, you can reward, you can recognize it, you can measure it, you can pay attention to it. So it fits back into the framework and the 6 decision points.
What would be your advice for a company that thought that they were hiring an individual that had aligned values, but then it doesn't?
Fire them.
How quickly?
Yesterday.
Okay.
So this is, I'm being a little bit, I'm being a little bit blunt here, but actually, ultimately, if somebody, as we discussed earlier, if somebody's values don't match, they have to wear a mask. And actually, they then become, they can, if they strongly do not fit your values, then they can become toxic to your organization. And there's this great saying: a leopard cannot change its spots. You can teach somebody, a person can learn new skills and they can learn new capabilities, but they cannot change their behavior. They can't change their values. It's just not worth the effort. Get rid of them. You're doing them a favor because they're in the wrong place, and you're doing the business a favor because they don't want the wrong person. You don't want the wrong person in the company.
So can I take that to another level and maybe have you also, what happens if a leader inside of their organization has a good performer, but is actually concerned that they are wearing a mask? How can you even tell?
Well, you will pick it up in their behavior, because assuming everybody is quite consistent in terms of everybody else is living the values, then this person will ultimately slip up. It's really, really hard if you're under stress, which most people are at work, and you're under deadlines, or you're being pushed for numbers, or you've got to get the code out, or whatever it is. It's really hard to maintain the mask all the time. So you will start to slip. That person will start to slip. They'll start to snap. They may start to behave in a brilliant jerk kind of way, or just a bad, and you, if you have your finger on the pulse, you get a sense from your team that this doesn't, they're almost a blocker. There's politics. There is a, they try and they do things around. They don't live the values, and you can see it. It doesn't really, the problem is most companies do not have a well-defined set of values and behaviors, and they don't have a strong culture and a functional culture, which means that people can sort of get away with it because it's all a bit of soup rather than specific vegetables.
Right. Sometimes the recipe is pretty unclear when you're identifying candidates. What do you think companies should be thinking about when they're trying to train their managers on how to be hiring managers based on values? Like, what would be some of your recommendations if it's not part of their training process yet?
So I would have the person X conversation with them. And I would look for them to really expand on those behaviors and to really understand what could have driven this person. Let's unpick person X, really unpick them. The second thing is I would ask them to come up with their own questions against the behaviors. So you can't just, creating behaviors-based interview questions is not, it seems quite simple, but actually you've got to ask a question that communicates against an actual behavior at a time that gives you a lot more insight into this candidate. So you can't ask a simple question. It's if you're looking for, another example of a good interview question, let's say feedback is one of your values. A good interview question for feedback is, when last did you give somebody feedback in a situation that wasn't easy? Take me through that process. And I would say, take me through a detailed step-by-step of that process. And first of all, if they don't give me detail, that'll knock them out because I need detail. Secondly, I really want to understand how they approached it. I want to understand what they said, and I want to understand what they learned and how they dealt with this difficult. What's their emotional intelligence like? Did they just steamroll a person, or were they considerate, etc. So it's how you ask the question. So I'd get those hiring managers to think about this and get them ready, and I'd teach them to be really good at it. And then I would get somebody who is experienced at doing these interviews to sit with them in the first interview, and actually either role play, but also interview a candidate with them and show them how to do it. I do that with my clients. So every single client, I sit with the hiring managers, or the VP of HR, if they haven't been through something like this, and I'll say, okay, let's run through an interview that we do with a candidate, and you will see, you'll get the insight. It's literally, you can actually see their eyes go, wow, okay, there's so much more depth there.
Do you have any additional guidance regarding the fact that we have almost a work from anywhere situation going on worldwide? Is there things that hiring managers should be trying to do when you can't get a sense of someone's full body language, or how they're expressing things? Are there any other tips that or assessments that we can use to make sure that we're hiring correctly based on the values?
Yeah, this should be a company-wide change in process rather than hiring manager trying to intuit things over this medium, which is really hard. And so what I do with my clients is we set up a task, and depending on the seniority, the task is longer or shorter. So the more senior the person, the longer the task. And as part of the hiring process, all candidates are informed that they will go through this task evaluation once if they get to the shortlist stage. So it's very clear. And so basically what we do is let's say it's a product manager role, we'll create a product management task where they have to speak to somebody in engineering, somebody in marketing, somebody in sales, and somebody in the C-suite. And they have to actually come up with a solution to the task and present it. But actually, over 2 weeks, while doing that, they're actually working with the team. And what I encourage my clients to do is to actually pay the person for 2 days of consulting work. So yes, you're working. Yes, you're giving us value. If you don't get the job, we're going to respect you and who you are. Mm-hmm. This is obviously quite a senior hire, but on the junior roles as well, we'll do something similar.
Okay. So engaging them in the team and really seeing how that dynamic lives out in the task. Okay. That's a great suggestion.
You work with the candidate though. It's not an interview process. It's a work with the candidate process.
Yeah. Okay. Great suggestion. And I think to answer the question of do you pay them for that time? You do, for sure.
Yeah.
So Own Your Culture is the book that I'm going to point folks to. What do you have planned out? What's in the future for you, Brett?
Well, Own Your Culture broke me. I'm not a very good writer. So
that's not funny, but I am laughing. I empathize.
I published the book in September, and apart from responding to emails, I haven't picked up a pen since then to write anything creative. But I'm getting there. So at the moment, I'm working on expanding my software. So we've built this software platform, and what we're doing, the software platform replicates my process, and I designed it over 18 months ago for distributed teams. And just by chance, and we've unfortunately gone into this pandemic, but actually it's positioned me really well to be able to deliver the service that I do anywhere in the world now. So I'm really investing quite heavily in the software now and building culture development initiatives around that, so that my clients can use more and more of the software once they've gone through the process with me.
Fantastic. So your current future focuses on making sure the platform kind of coincides and helps people implement that inside their businesses. Fantastic. Exactly. Brett, is there anything I didn't think to ask you that you were hoping to share today?
No, I think you've covered I think pretty much all. I think the only thing that I one might explore a little bit is the difference between excuse me.
No worries.
The difference between leading in an office environment versus leading in a remote environment, which is a little bit more coach focused than it is alpha, sort of male or female focused. Because there are a number of studies showing that the leaders of remote environments are not the same people as the leaders of office-based environments. They end up being much more supportive and operationally minded versus the charismatic, talker, speaker, that person we're used to following in an office. But other than that, I've really enjoyed the conversation, Ellie. I think you've covered it all.
Awesome. I love the fact that you've added that in. I think that is something worthwhile for our listeners to be thinking about as we have leaders who are leading remote workforces, that it is requiring maybe some different skill sets and some different talents than if you're in office. That's such a great point. Thank you, Brett. I so appreciate you joining us here on the podcast today, and look forward to getting update sometime in the near future.
Ellie, my pleasure, and thanks very much for your time. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.